Bienvenidos.
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 Welcome to the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast,
The show for Spanish learners
that love music,
travel, and culture.
Close your grammar textbooks,
Shut down the language apps, and open your ears
how Spanish is spoken in the real world.
Let us show you
How to go from beginner
to bilingual.
Here's your host,
certified language coach.
Tamara Marie.
Hola, bienvenidos al podcast Learn Spanish con Salsa. Welcome to another episode of the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast. I'm your host, Tamara Marie, and I am joined today by one of our newest members of the team at Spanish con Salsa. So we are going to be talking all about her life and how she came to become a language coach and teacher. And I think you'll be fascinated by her story because I think a lot of times we think it's hard to learn another language, or maybe we have some obstacles in the way, and we're really not sure if we're ever going to get fluent. And I think her story really will help inspire you that even if you feel like you're stuck in your language learning journey, that it is absolutely possible for you to become bilingual, no matter what your age, no matter what your circumstances. So I'm excited to introduce our newest member of the team of Spanish con Salsa, and she is from Puerto Rico. So we're going to be talking a little bit about how she grew up, how she became a teacher, and of course, when we end, I'll talk about how you can join her if you want to learn more about Puerto Rican Spanish as well. So I would like to say bienvenida, Marla Rivera. Welcome to the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast.
Thank you, Tamara. Pleasure to be here.
So, Marla, I know that one of the reasons why I was really impressed with you is because I know when we initially talked, you were explaining that you are an interpreter, which I think is a whole different set of skills. I think a lot of people just think that someone who knows multiple languages should just be able to translate for them on the fly. I know I get asked that all the time. People are like, "Oh, can you tell me what they said?" I'm like, "Okay, I can," but like, this is a lot, right? You've got to do translation of not just the words, but the meaning and in real time. And I've had a few interpreters on the podcast before, and I'm always amazed. So why don't you start out first before we get into all of how you became an interpreter, because I think that's a fascinating story. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, and how it is that you got into language learning.
Of course. So I am from Guaynabo, Puerto Rico. I grew up with my parents, my two siblings, and in the middle north or east region of the island. And I started teaching, right before that, I started learning languages myself. I learned French and then American Sign Language simultaneously. And I started by learning how to interpret American Sign Language. And by that, I grabbed this love for learning languages. And from that, I discovered how to, grow that into a love for teaching languages. And I had students I taught English to and tutored on my own free time. And they helped me with American Sign Language. And then I went and as a part-time job, I taught Spanish.
Wow. So you learned French and American Sign Language at the same time. So what made you want to learn ASL and French? Like what drew you to those two languages specifically?
French was the country, France, and I always wanted to go to France and learn what they're saying and be able to, navigate and watch movies and all that. And without having to use subtitles. And it was such an interesting culture and different language that I really wanted to know, what it was all about. And American Sign Language, because it's so expressive, it is very alive, very vivid. Like you have to use your whole body and your facial expression. Otherwise, you're giving it a whole other meaning to the sign. You can give it a whole other like sarcastic meaning to a sign if you have a neutral face when you're supposed to have a happy face, for example. And that really drew me. I was seeing deaf people or people like interpreters signing around the island, and that drew me to that. Also, I had a friend that was taking classes, and he suggested I would take classes, and I would practice with him as well. And that really allowed me to grow and start loving the language.
Wow. Okay. So I do have questions about this because we do have two other members of our team that know ASL. So Kessia and Hael both have that background, and I've always been curious about this because in English, I know we have. I mean, it's American Sign Language, right? So, um, there's a certain way of expression, but then we also have sort of like a Black American Sign Language, which apparently is more expressive. And so is it different? Do you find in like Puerto Rico, like the way and the expressions, is it different than what you might find here in the United States on the mainland as far as how
Yes.
people sign and how they express themselves?
It's a bit different. Some signs in Puerto Rico are only Puerto Rican. Only somebody from the island would use them. And sometimes are straight from the mainland US. Um, I haven't interacted with a lot of deaf communities here in the mainland. I haven't found many where I live, but I'm living in Indiana currently. But in, from what I've been taught from my deaf teachers that did live in Indiana, sorry, not Indiana, the US, they did teach me that so this sign, people don't use it in the US. This sign they do. And I would say in Puerto Rico, they're even slightly more expressive from what they taught me because Puerto Ricans are very loud and expressive by nature. Not to take away from the US deaf community, but only because we are more touchy, more loving, expressing our love physically, and more expressive by nature itself.
Okay, that's interesting. I think that that's similar to like Black American Sign Language because there is a little bit more
More
expressiveness, and
expression. Yeah.
I've heard from the deaf community, the Black community, is that they feel that American Sign Language is a bit stifling because it's like they have to fit into these rigid ways. So,
Yep.
could you? Because now I'm just curious because I find this whole thing fascinating. Could you maybe give us an example of a sign that's different in Puerto Rico versus in mainland U.S.?
For us, it was, if I'm not mistaken, it was PR, Puerto Rico. And
Hmm.
then in the US, they also say PR. Like they separate. Instead of putting the island, they put
Oh, okay.
PR. And we
Oh,
put
so
the
just the
island. Yeah.
letters.
Yeah.
Ah, okay. So the hand at the bottom is kind of like the island
The
sign.
island.
Ah, okay. That's interesting. Now I do remember like my like letters in ASL, but I don't remember like the I have very limited vocabulary with that, but that is fascinating. Okay, so you learned ASL, then you learned French. You said that you were interested because you wanted to visit France potentially one
Yes.
day. So how would you say the process was for you learning them both at the same time? Because I know for a lot of people, like just learning one language can be overwhelming. So how did you approach? I mean, I know they're very different too, so that may have helped, right? But how did you approach learning them both at the same time?
You're right. They're very different, and that did help. Because ASL has a different structure, but it helped also in the sense that I had a bachelor's. I was taking a bachelor's in French. That's my bachelor's in Puerto Rico, in the University of Puerto Rico, from Monday to Friday, and my ASL classes were only Saturday, every Saturday for 3 or 4 months, every semester, and it was multiple semesters, and that helped in the sense that is less workload, knowing that in the week I only study certain days, my homework for the university, and then I also constantly have one day in the week during the week that I study ASL, and then do the homework, and also do the meetings in person to better the sign language, and then in weekends and Saturday I would go and do the in-person class.
Okay, so it sounds like you had like a really good time management schedule set up where
Thank you.
you had time dedicated for languages, and it probably also helped that you were dedicating your studies to it in university, so you definitely had the
Yes.
time
Yes.
to learn French. So answer me this question because I know a lot of people listen to this podcast have had different experiences learning languages in a school or academic environment. So how was your experience learning French in Puerto Rico? Did you feel like when you came out of that, you were able to have a conversation in French and that you were conversational, or did you have to supplement that with things you did outside of your classes to really feel comfortable speaking the language?
I would say that I did feel like I came out being able to talk French, but at the same time, to lessen the nerves of talking to a French native, I would need to supplement that either with a French native or with another French learner. What we would do is we would meet in the hallways and we would practice among our friends from French class. And I have friends in French class and friends outside of it that also knew French, and I would talk to them every chance I got because talking to a French native was very daunting back then. I still sometimes feel nervous, even though I am better. I'm way better than I was back then. I still feel that that those nerves at the beginning, but after a while, they go away eventually.
Yeah, and do you have a lot of opportunity to speak French, like to maintain it, or do you still have conversations in French regularly, or listen to things in French?
Unfortunately, not conversations. I do listen to movies and with the subtitles and with the audio in French and music. I listen to a lot of French music, specifically
Okay.
Stromae. I love that singer.
Oh, nice, nice. Okay. So I think it's interesting too because in the process of learning a language, like you mentioned, like those nerves in the beginning, you're like, oh, yeah, I don't want to talk to a native speaker because it's like, oh, you're freeze up. Maybe I'll
Yes.
understand them. Then what am I going to say? I think a lot of people listening can relate to that. I was going to ask you if there was a moment where, in your language learning journey, whether it was with ASL or French, and even English, because we haven't talked about that, because I imagine growing up in Puerto Rico, you learned both Spanish and English in school. Was there ever a moment when you felt like, oh, I think I actually know what I'm doing now, or like I feel like I might actually be fluent in this
Yes.
language? Like, did you have a moment? Because I know for me, so
Yes.
I'll share like briefly. Like, so one of the things that happened to me earlier on in my learning Spanish is I went to Mexico and I got food poisoning, which I mean, not novel experience from Mexico, unfortunately. And I was sitting in this hotel. And it had to be like 3 o'clock in the morning. I was like sick. It was just me and my son. And I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do. And so I called the front desk, and they put a doctor on the phone to talk to me, and he didn't speak English. So I had to explain to this doctor what my symptoms were in Spanish. The hotel sent someone to my room to go get me medicine that the doctor told me that I should take. I had to transact all this money to give him money to go get the medicine, to bring it back, to read the instructions, to take the
Yep.
medicine, all at like 3 a.m. when I was clearly like not my best self,
Yeah.
right? And after I got out of that, I made it back to the US without dying. I was like,
That's why you
I
got it.
I feel like I might be fluent now because if I was able to do all of that at 4 a.m., like when I was up, like, and I
Yes.
won't share the details, not in my best state, I felt like I was doing pretty good. So
That
hopefully
sounds
yours
rough.
wasn't like food poisoning, but like, did you have a moment like that where you realized, like, I really think I'm fluent now? I think I got this.
Yes. Specifically when after I graduated and moved to the US, well, with my husband, I was in a taxi, and the taxi was taking us to a hotel because we were staying with family. We were reunited. We were already living in the States, but the family was visiting in Chicago. So we took our car somewhere, and then we took a taxi farther out to the hotel. For some reason, I don't remember why. And I remember that the taxi driver was Haitian, and his first language was French. He knew Creole, he knew French, and he knew English. And when I heard that, I asked him, "Oh, you said you were from Haiti, right?" And all in French. And I started talking to him in French. He's like, "Oh, you speak very well." And we started speaking like, "Oh, where are you from? Where did you study? How long have you been speaking French? You speak it super well." And that moment when he understood everything, being a French native, I was like, I think I got this.
Yeah, especially I think talking to someone from Haiti, because I imagine his accent was a little bit different than like someone
Yes, it is
from France
different.
or from Paris. So yeah. Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, I think those moments always kind of let us know like, oh, okay, so I haven't been wasting my time, because I think with
Yeah.
learning languages, so it sometimes just feels like you're not making progress, right? So having
Yeah, you
those
feel kind of stuck.
experiences,
Yeah,
yeah, it like proves to
sometimes.
you that like even though you're scared, even though you feel like you're not prepared, you get through it. And I think that's when we
Exactly.
could like say, "Oh, okay, maybe I'm not doing so bad after all."
Definitely,
Cool.
I know that feeling.
So talk to me a little bit about growing up in Puerto Rico. So you mentioned, sort of growing up and learning ASL and French in university, but how did you learn English? Did you? Because I know just different friends I have in Puerto Rico. Depending on where you were on the island and how your family was, you may or may not have learned English conversationally.
Yes.
You may have just learned it in school. And
Hmm.
I've heard even some teachers don't speak English very well or at all. They just kind of teach it. So talk a little bit about growing up bilingual in a bilingual, area. Like how was that for you, and how did you feel about your English and Spanish skills as you were kind of growing up in Puerto Rico?
So I grew up in the metro area, and that area had a lot of schools that are known to have either American schools, American military schools, private schools, even and it does also have public schools. But I went to a public school first, and then a private school, and but since I was very little, I knew English because of TV. I watched everything in TV. If my parents bought me any books, any music, anything, it was all in English because they wanted me to know the language, not just Spanish. And they saw that I would grasp it quickly, like my brother, and they just let me keep going. Everything, absolutely everything, was in English. And when I was 2 or 3, they said I was saying full sentences in English. All the colors, all the everything the little kids would do, animals, colors, letters, everything. I already was talking in English completely. And from there, it was all high school, elementary, everything. I had good teachers in for English class, fortunately. But it does what you said, that there's a lot of teachers that don't speak English very well. They just teach it, but they don't have a good accent or a good command of it. That is very true, unfortunately, for a lot of people, both in private and public schools. It happens everywhere on the island, and it has to do a lot with the older generation seeing English as the colonizers' language, because Puerto Rico, as many of you may know, is a territory, as a U.S. territory, and since it is a U.S. territory, the older generation, my grandparents, my parents' generation, they're like, oh, I'll finish the English class, I'll get it over with. I'm not using that ever again. I don't need it. I don't want it, kind of thing. That's how they view it back then. Since Gen X, my sister's generation, and my generation, we've been really accepting of it. That's because I say that because I see a lot of my sister's age, 34, 35, and slightly younger, that are very accepting and know English very well.
Yeah, I think it also depends on the area, because you mentioned being in the metro area, so I imagine it was a little bit different there too, just because there's
Yes,
probably more tourism, more people. I found the further I
which
left San Juan out of the outskirts, the less likely it was for people to speak English.
that as well.
So
Yes.
it's yeah, it's really interesting dynamic. I definitely find on the island. And you also mentioned like the colonizers language. So not to get too far into like the political situation, but how do you feel about that in terms of just because obviously you're in the mainland now and you speak English very well, you speak Spanish. So what is kind of your take on that idea of like Puerto Rico being independent or just the culture being this really bilingual culture? What do you kind of feel about that?
I feel like it's fine being a bilingual culture because it has a beautiful blend of both. But
Mhm.
if Puerto Rico somehow magically, someday becomes independent, I don't see it coming anytime soon. But if it does, I wouldn't mind it. It'll be awesome. But right now, as a mix of both cultures, I think it's fine because we having Latino culture and American culture doesn't take away from the Latino culture. It's very much prevalent, and anybody that goes to Puerto Rico can can see that the Latino is very prevalent. It's not suppressed currently by the American culture. Maybe it was back then, in my
Mm-hmm.
grandparents' time, because there was a lot of laws. Not
Mm-hmm.
now, though.
Oh, that's interesting. It's funny. I think one of the last few times I went to Puerto Rico, I was on a farm, and I think I said something about Latino culture, and he kind of scoffed at me and said, "We're not Latinos. We're from the Caribbean. That's different." I was like, "Oh, my bad. Sorry." Like he was just very much like, "I don't know what you're talking about, you American." I was
Yeah,
like,
that's weird take because we're very much Latinos.
"Okay."
That's a weird take, yeah.
Yeah, he was just like, no, we're not Latino. But I also find Latino as a term just seems to be something that only comes into play when you leave where you're from. Like when you're in Puerto Rico, you're not walking around going, I'm a Latino. You're like, well, I'm Puerto Rican, right? Like I'm in Puerto, like, like I think that's a very American thing just to say that you are a Latino because it's something like I feel like is more invented by being in the diaspora and being away from home because you mainly would just identify with home like if you're there,
Yeah. Yeah,
it's like I don't
that
walk
makes
around
sense.
saying I'm American, or whatever. It like until I go somewhere and I have to show my passport, it becomes obvious, but it's not something I think about day to day. But yeah, it was just funny
Yes.
that he said. I was like, oh, he's all right.
Yeah,
You're
that's weird.
Caribbean. Got it. Okay, dude. Sorry. Oh, so when did you move from Puerto Rico to the mainland?
I moved in 2017 to first to Illinois, then
Hmm.
to Ohio for my husband's job, and then here in Indiana. And Illinois was first because that's where I got my master's for interpreting and translation.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great segue. So let's talk about interpreting. So how is it that you became an interpreter? Because I know some people listening are probably interested in becoming an interpreter. So, what were the qualifications? Like, what was the process you went through? And did you find it difficult? Like, what was the most difficult part about just going from, oh, I'm bilingual to being an interpreter?
I was interested in languages, like I said before, for many years. Since even before learning French and American Sign Language, I was interested in English before that. And I grasped English from a very young age. But when people were starting pointing out that I knew English, you don't think about it when you know it natively like I do, because I grew up bilingual. But when people started pointing out that I knew English very well, I'm like, oh yeah, I guess I do. And I started looking more into English, like reading more on purpose, because before I didn't used to read books out of school. So I started furthering my education into English. And then that turned into a love for language, further on with French and American Sign Language. And when I was exposed to American Sign Language interpreters, I was like, that's what I want to do, but I'm not sure for what language. And then looking up information online, I was confident that I wanted to do it for English and Spanish specifically, seeing that there's a lot of need for that. And back then, I didn't have confidence to interpret professionally for French and American Sign Language. So that's how I got to the decision of specifically going for Spanish and English. And after that, it was a matter of looking for where. So I searched interpreting schools, and I found a very good one. University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. They have a top, very amazing program for languages. Foreign languages department is top notch. And from there, the qualifications were having a proficiency test for your second language. In this case, it would be mine, technically English, but I took that online, if I'm not mistaken. Sorry, it's been a long time, but if I'm not mistaken, I took it online. And also having a certain amount of credits from your university. And I had mine available from my bachelor's. And other than that, being a U.S. resident or citizen or having a visa. And then that was it. Like there's no specific like other like just the language test, the credits, and the citizen or resident or visa requirements.
Okay, so once you got into the program, what was it? What was the training like to become an interpreter? Like, how many hours did you have to do? Like, what types of things that were different from just like, when you were learning French in university? Like, what did your program for interpretation kind of emphasize?
For interpretation, it was um, the different techniques interpretation. For example, there's what is called whispering interpretation, which is when the interpreter is in a conference, a political conference, or walking with a diplomat, and they're walking and greeting everybody. Or it's a conference and the interpreter sits behind the person, and there's multiple people with different interpreters, so you can't, say it out loud. And they don't have available the headsets and all that you see on movies. So you have to sit behind the person and whisper in their ear what they're saying, and say it loudly back if somebody wants to hear the person you're speaking to. If that person wants to say something loud back, then that interpreter will take over. But otherwise, just whisper interpreting. They would also focus on different techniques and teach you how to use the course of theory. They will teach you different theories, different techniques for memorization, breaking down information, the pacing, and of course the sound system, and the soundproof room where interpreters would plug it into the mic. If it's a big conference with a one speaker and a podium, the interpreter would plug it into that audio, and then would speak into people's headphones. And that's how we do that. And we also train in relay interpreting, which would be one interpreter does it for one certain amount of time, and then they signal to their partner in the booth, and that person at a certain moment, when the interpreter that's interpreting gives them the signal, immediately they would switch without literally 2 seconds gap, and they would take over in basically the same sentence. And they also train in consecutive interpreting, which is you talk, I interpret, and then you talk, I interpret, like that. And simultaneous interpreting, which is the one for the podium. I just explained. The podium is speaking, and I constantly interpret nonstop.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. So I didn't realize there are that many different styles, different types of interpreting.
Yes.
What would you say is the most challenging thing about being an interpreter?
The most challenging thing, it would be retaining the information for simultaneous interpreting, I would say. Oh, that one is very difficult. Simultaneous interpreting is, in my opinion, and in a lot of interpreters' opinion that I have heard, it is the most difficult method of interpreting, because it requires you to do 3 things at the same time: listen, retain or memorize, and verbalize the message all at the same time. You're listening in one language, let's say it's English, you're memorizing that, and then at the same time I am interpreting into Spanish the previous sentence, but memorizing the next sentence and listening to the next sentence after that. That is extremely difficult. The other second most difficult thing I would say is minute details like numbers. That's why they tell you to write it down, and they give you techniques. They teach you techniques to writing stuff down as well. It takes I think you also asked me about hours. Like every semester, it took 2 years. The program, by the way, is 2 years. Every semester was like 30 hours for the interpreting class. But I also took translation, so I took a lot of classes in translation as well.
Wow. That does sound like I could just see me trying to remember and like just blanking or forgetting something.
It is very difficult.
What would you say, either in interpreting or just like in language learning in general, what would you say is either like the most embarrassing or funniest mistake you've ever made in another language?
In another language, I think I have the most embarrassing that was kind of funny was I changed the gender accidentally of the person speaking. It was a man, but the person I was talking, that man was talking to, was an officer, and she was female. So I was talking as the officer to the man, and the man said señora, which is ma'am in Spanish. So when he said that, I said ma'am to her, saying his message. And when she relayed back sir, señor, I said señora again accidentally. And it's like, oh, I'm sorry. So I interpreted correction.
Sorry, ma'am.
Señor. Señor was sorry. And he laughed. He didn't care. But it was kind of, I was like, my bad.
Well, I would say from all the stories I've heard over the years of people learning languages, that's probably the most mild mistake. like for so if that's your most embarrassing one, that's really good. Like it's usually you're pretty proficient at languages. So do you have a favorite word or phrase? And it could be in French or English or Spanish. Like, do you just have like a favorite phrase that you like that's maybe unique to the language or says something about the culture?
I would say awesome. I just say it a lot. I don't know what, I just like it. The word awesome in English. It's just fun to say. It expresses so much. It's always so positive. I just like that word. And the most similar thing that I can think of in Spanish, specifically Puerto Rican Spanish, brutal. And it's like the closest thing to awesome. I also say brutal a lot.
Give me an example of how you use brutal, because I was thinking chévere, because I think that's what most people
chévere, we also use that a lot.
Yeah.
I write that, but yeah.
How would you use brutal?
If we're saying, oh, dude, that party was awesome last night. You should have been there. Where were you? In Spanish, it would be, pana, esa fiesta estaba brutal. ¿Dónde tú estabas? Te lo perdiste. Like that. We also say chévere a lot. I actually type chévere a lot, but in person, I'm finding myself to say brutal, specifically to other Puerto Ricans, because that's a Puerto Rican term. And if you say it outside of Puerto Rico, I don't think a lot of Spanish speakers would know what you're talking about.
Yeah, because in English it's like translates. It sounds like brutal. It's like, oh, that was horrible.
It does sound like brutal. Yeah, it sounds rough. Exactly, like brutal, rough.
It's like, was that a good party or not? Like,
So are you saying it's a bad party?
Right. All right, cool. Well, thank you so much, Marla. Gracias for sharing a little bit about yourself and your experience learning languages. And I hope that somebody listening, if they felt like, wow, I'm just struggling to get fluent in Spanish, that, it is possible to learn multiple languages and even languages that are very different. So thank you for sharing your experience, and hopefully we'll get you back on the podcast soon to share more about Puerto Rican Spanish.
Thank you for having me.
And that is going to be it for this episode of the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast. I hope you have enjoyed this episode, that you learned something new. So if you're thinking about being an interpreter, or you just want to get to a state where you are speaking Spanish fluently, I hope Marla's story is encouraging to you. And also, if you're interested in learning more Spanish, either from Puerto Rico or just conversational Spanish from Latin America in general, definitely go to our website, learnspanishconsalsa.com. The link for this episode, we will include some information about how you can sign up for a free language coaching session if you want to learn Spanish with Marla or any other member of our team here at Spanish con Salsa. We have a very conversational approach. So if you've been, learning Spanish with an app, or maybe you took some classes in high school and that high school Spanish is not getting you where you want to be, make sure you go to learnspanishconsalsa.com. We will definitely be able to help you get past that hump so that you can get some experience speaking Spanish and you get comfortable speaking with native Spanish speakers. As always, I hope something in this episode has helped you go from Spanish beginner to bilingual. Hasta la próxima.
Thank you for listening to the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast at learnspanishconsalsa.com.